Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast, episode 4. I'm here with Dan Feldman, and Dan is just going to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his background.
Yeah, thanks, man. So my name is Dan Feldman, as you said. I am a registered dietitian here in the United States. I also have my master's degree in human nutrition, also a certified personal trainer through NASM. I currently actually wear a few different hats. So I do some online nutrition and training coaching through a really great company called Macros Inc. I additionally do some research with another really great company called examine.com, which a lot of you guys might have heard of. And then I also own my own private practice where I see clients for mainly for nutrition, but for some training as well. All that's online. A lot of them actually use their health insurance. I've been lucky enough to network with a bunch of insurance companies here in the United States, so I can get people what they need, get them the nutrition services, dietitian services that they need, and they can have it covered under their health insurance. So that's a little bit about me. Oh, and then I'm also a competitive powerlifter. Ross and I met over Instagram, so my handle there is powerlifter dietitian. So I compete in USAPL. Generally in the 74 kilogram class. I weigh 157 to 160 pounds and moderately decent at that in that weight class. So, a lot of the stuff that I do, a lot of the content that I produce is around, training and powerlifting and nutrition for powerlifters, as well as just, fat loss and sort of more general health. So, just a little bit about me.
A little bit being an understatement. Yeah. So that's where our interest kind of crossed, where I have a big interest. My background's exercise, but my interest is a lot in nutrition. And then I've done powerlifting as well myself. So your content is right. I almost feel like you're speaking to me sometimes.
I appreciate that.
It's very, very useful. And the powerlifting dietitian, I'd recommend checking his stuff out on Instagram. So then your background as a dietitian, what did you specialize in terms of your studies, and then what type of clients do you work with now? Who's your kind of ideal client?
Yeah. So as far as my studies, I mean, I know we were talking about it this off air, the process to becoming a registered dietitian in the United States. You don't necessarily have to specialize in anything particular. You get a pretty well-rounded program of where we do a little bit of the sports nutrition and counseling and stuff like that, but then a lot of focus on nutrition for various disease states, as well as stuff that would probably be not particularly relevant for your listeners. So things like food service. So when you go into a food establishment, they have dietitians to make sure that the food is prepared appropriately to prevent foodborne illness. So, and then just a lot of really random things like that. But I mean, the path to becoming a dietitian was a little bit more general, although my master's degree actually focused really on, learning how to read and interpret nutrition literature and being able to kind of disseminate that towards a little bit more of a lay population. So, when we see a headline in a lay publication, being able to sort of see the study that went behind that and being able to analyze the study and being able to see is the headline really representative of the actual study? We did a lot of stuff like that, learning this kind of statistics behind research. So I can actually interpret it, right? Because I know a lot of us might come across some peer-reviewed literature and it's very, very dense and very difficult to read. So a lot of what I've done is kind of focused on, being able to, come up with the kind of practical applications from nutrition literature. Now, me specifically, obviously, I'm a powerlifter, so my personal interest does sort of skew towards more strength and physique goals. So things like fat loss, appetite regulation, Obviously, nutrition for gaining muscle and strength and things like that are a little bit more up my alley. But at the same time, my research interests are relatively broad. So as I mentioned, I do some research for Examine, and we've got specifically, I work on a part of the website called Study Summaries, where we review probably around 200 peer-reviewed studies per month and create summaries to kind of just sort of give you what you need from each study. And that really encompasses a pretty wide variety of topics. So beyond that, muscle gain or fat loss, there's also studies on cannabis, right? I've been reading a lot about cannabis lately. Allergies and immunity, depression, healthy aging, really pretty wide variety of things. So I've got my kind of my personal interest with the powerlifting, muscle gain, fat loss, at the same time, also digesting and absorbing a lot of research about a lot of other stuff as well. So, yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So I have probably read some of your work very recently because I'm subscribed to Examine. So for anyone who doesn't know, Examine is like a site that, you correct me here if I'm wrong, but basically it gets the research that comes out very regularly and then explains it in kind of layman's terms for someone who's not maybe like qualified, or someone who is trying to become more qualified in terms of learning about nutrition. So it's basically like the best hub for nutrition information around that I've come across. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And even if you are an expert, even if you are very proficient with reading research, still like so much new research comes out. It's impossible to read that much unless it's like literally all that you do. It's impossible, 200 studies per month, unless it's like your full-time job. It's going to be very difficult for you to read and sort of absorb 200 studies per month, right? So with this, right, at least with this part of the membership, the Examine membership, right, you can choose what topics you're interested in. Maybe it's cannabis, maybe it's fat loss, maybe it's depression, maybe it's women's health, whatever it is. You choose your categories, and then you get, every month you get study summaries for those categories. So it really, really saves time, especially if you are a relatively busy health professional, even if you are really proficient with reading research. When you can trust that experts are creating these summaries, reading through the studies and creating summaries that are accurate reflections of what's actually in the research, right? Because again, we all know we see headlines in lay media, or even, well-intentioned health practitioners and dietitians, doctors, whatever, and they don't actually accurately reflect what the research says,
Absolutely. Yeah. Someone, they have a bias, or they're in a certain camp, and then it's like, it's just confirmation bias the whole time. Like they're just looking for the research, 200 studies come out a month, at least one of them is going to have a favorable result for their bias, or, disprove something else that they don't believe in. And yeah, it's very easy to cherry pick data. So then, based on how like well read you are, do you work with more advanced clients, or like the ideal person that you would work with?
I mean, I work with a pretty decent variety. I would say most of my clients are either looking to lose fat or potentially build muscular strength. I work with a fair number of more sort of general population folks who are just looking to get to a little bit better shape or lose some weight, stuff like that. I also have worked with individuals who are more advanced strength athletes. I've worked with a actually national level powerlifter relatively recently on his nutrition. I've worked with dietitians before, so it's pretty well varied, but at the same time, I do have my niche.
Yeah, very good. I don't know if you know much about like combat sports, about like, the UFC, MMA, and boxing. Have you done more work with that recently? Because I feel like if I had to pick one sport that's on the rise, I would say that sport is. But then there's a huge potential for nutrition, because I think combat sport athletes typically were like really of the no pain, no gain mentality, and they kind of didn't focus on like the small details. So there's a huge area for potential there. Have you worked with any athletes from those kind of sports?
It's funny you asked that, because literally yesterday someone else was like reached out to me on Instagram. It's like, oh, are you working with combat sport athletes right now? I have not worked with any currently, but yeah, there's definitely a need for those athletes to see a dietitian, or at least a coach who's really in the know when it comes to nutrition, because obviously those athletes do typically have pretty aggressive weight cutting protocols and potentially dehydration protocols. So making sure that you're cutting weight, if you are a combat athlete, making sure that you're cutting weight in a way that does not sacrifice performance or health is really quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's the fundamentals that apply to nutrition, and even though sports vary, the fundamentals don't really change that much. So if someone is trying to cut weight, they're essentially getting into a fat loss phase, and the only variables that would change would be how severe, and then the time length that the person had available to them. So if I was a combat sport athlete, I would have absolutely no hesitation in going to you, because you have so much knowledge with nutrition. So that's great. So you talk a lot about like myths in nutrition. We talked a little bit about sugar and sugar addiction and stuff like that. What do you think, as someone who knows the research, what do you think are some of the biggest like misconceptions or myths that are out there, like really pervasive in nutrition?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of them. I mean, off the top of my head, something I've posted about like 20 times on my Instagram is artificial sweeteners. I mean, you can right now Google, so aspartame, right? That's the most vilified artificial sweetener.
Just to be clear, they do cause cancer, and they're gonna kill us all eventually, right? That's what's gonna happen.
So not exactly. Yeah, I mean, most of us have probably heard stuff about aspartame, which is again just the artificial sweetener that's in like the equal packets. If you get those sort of 0-calorie packets and some Diet Coke and stuff like that, go to Dr. Google and you'll see, aspartame causes cancer, it causes weight gain, it causes MS, it causes Alzheimer's, it causes all this stuff. And you'll even see health practitioners, doctors, dietitians saying that it causes all of these bad things. But the research in humans looking at realistic doses of it show that that's just not the case. It does not cause any of those things. It's not even associated with any of those things. People who use artificial sweeteners such as aspartame instead of sugar lose more weight and maintain that weight. So it has a neutral to positive effect in that way. And even if you look at, again, I'm just focused on aspartame. If you look at the actual components of aspartame, it's got it basically is composed of phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and is it methanol or ethanol? But basically,
I think it's ethanol, is it?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll let you.
Yeah. So basically, aspartame, it basically breaks down into phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and methanol in the body, right?
Yeah.
Phenylalanine, aspartic acid are just amino acids that are found in way greater concentrations, way greater quantities in foods that have protein in them: chicken, eggs, milk, soy. Just like you get way greater concentrations of phenylalanine and aspartic acid in everyday foods than you would from aspartame. And then methanol, while large amounts of methanol is bad, you actually get larger quantities of methanol in foods like bananas and tomatoes than you would from aspartame. So even on a mechanistic level, it doesn't really make sense that aspartame would cause any sort of negative, significant negative effects on health. And again, when we look at actually, studies that use that where humans actually use aspartame, we don't see any of these negative effects. Now, you could look at some rodent research where they give them just monumentally huge amounts of aspartame and weird things happen. But that is, that's just not generalizable to humans. And then something else also sort of on that same wavelength is people talk about the gut microbiome being negatively affected by artificial sweeteners. Generally speaking, they refer to I don't remember the author's name, but there's one paper in particular which mainly looked at the artificial sweetener that's in Sweet and Low, which is not aspartame. You need to pull that up really quick. But basically, they looked at that one and they found saccharin. So they they looked at they looked at aspartame and sucralose and saccharin, but it was really saccharin that in rodents had some weird effects on the gut microbiome. Or not even weird effects, it just caused changes in the gut microbiome. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that they did they moved this, they did they did this thing where they basically take the stool sample from the rodents and they transplanted them in humans, or maybe it was vice versa, and then they also found some alterations in the other species. I would need to have the study in front of me to really look at it, but basically, so people use that as evidence that artificial sweeteners cause dysbiosis in the gut microbiome, right? And for one thing, for most of those results really looked at saccharin, which is a completely different artificial sweetener with a completely different chemical structure that's actually less common than aspartame, or the one that's in Splenda called sucralose, and does not have the same safety profile. And like minor perturbations in the gut microbiome are not necessarily a negative thing. So I'm getting really into the weeds, so I'm going to kind of stop myself there. But basically, long story short is that if you use stuff with artificial sweeteners in it in normal quantities, it's fine.
Yeah, good to hear it from someone like an expert such as yourself, to get that, the record straight on that. So then, we know obesity is on the rise, and type 2 diabetes and lots of chronic health conditions are on the rise. Would using artificial sweeteners, because you said that it actually helps weight loss, would you say that artificial sweeteners is actually healthier than using things like sugar or honey, even though, in the media it gets a really bad reputation, kind of like when you really think about it, because there is no calories, but it still has the same sweetness, do you think it'll actually be a better option over the lifespan?
So I'm going to give you a really cop-out answer, and that is it depends, right? A lot of people like to look at very specific foods and say, is this better than that? But it obviously depends, right? A sugar-sweetened beverage, fruit juice, or even soda or whatever it is, can have its place in the diet, right? For example, if someone is not looking to lose weight, fruit juices, can be a good way for someone to get in, some B vitamins and whatnot, and maybe they just like having some juice. If they're not worried about losing weight, and they can kind of fit that into their carbohydrate allotment, calorie allotment for the day, it might not be an issue. And soda isn't really going to provide any nutritional value, but and it's not something that you should be drinking tons and tons of, but having it occasionally, if you're not, and assuming your overall diet is relatively healthful, it's just going to add some carbohydrates and calories, and as long as you keep it in moderation, it's fine. Now, if someone is specifically looking to lose body fat, substituting sugar sweetened beverages or caloric beverages, whether that be soda, whether that be fruit juice, stuff like that, with an artificially sweetened, low calorie or calorie free beverage is a very sensible choice, because we know that liquid calories are not particularly satiating as compared to eating your calories. So swapping a Coke for a Diet Coke is a really nice way to cut down your calories without affecting satiation in any way. And similar thing, if you wanted to use, instead of fruit juice, you wanted to use, I use the, if you ever see the Neofit waters, where you just kind of put the drops in your water and it flavors it, or Crystal Light or things like that. I think those can be really good options in those cases. They're not going to cause, they're not going to increase your risk of cancer. They're not going to increase your risk of any sort of terrible disease. They are going to have minimal impact on blood sugar. Yeah, and if anything, they'll help with weight loss and fat loss. So a little bit of a more lengthy answer, but depending on the context, yes, it can be helpful to make those substitutions.
Great. Yeah. Just funny related story on the Mio sugar kind of substitute for drink. So a friend of mine is doing a cut right now, and he actually was like really trying to manage his calories, and he was drinking the Mios, and he ended up getting like heartburn because he was having too much of the Mio. He didn't know that was like a potential side effect. So you can't overdo these things. You know, they're not without like the limitations, but it's when you go into excessive quantities of anything, you're going to run into problems. So yeah, that was a good
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, absolutely. And if it and like just like with anything, if you, I mean, yeah, if you overconsume anything, like if you eat too many apples, you're going to have some gastrointestinal issues. You know what I mean? So that's just being sort of sensible with it. And people act like they're like, oh, if I have, like what if I drink 25 cans of Diet Coke? Well, don't drink 25 cans of Diet Coke per day. Like that's weird. Don't, and weird eating patterns are generally not ideal. But again, keep it as long as you're eating a sensible amount of it, not a crazy amount of this stuff, it's nothing to worry about.
Yeah. Yeah. Moderation is like the hardest skill to learn, but I think it's one of the most important.
Yeah.
So speaking of moderation and then excessive doses, is food addictive and is sugar addictive? Any kind of thoughts on that? And sugar is demonized a lot as well. Should we like be kind of wary of our sugar intake because of the link with type 2 diabetes?
So there's a couple things there. I'll hit on the addictive part second. Sugar, sugar in it of itself is not harmful. People don't realize that the carbohydrates that you eat for the most part in your diet, like all of those break down to sugar. All of those break down to blood glucose. All of the carbohydrates that you eat ultimately are going to be broken down to glucose or fructose or galactose. And then the fructose and galactose are eventually going to make their way into similar pathways, the similar glycolytic pathway. It'll enter at least the fructose will enter in a little bit more of a roundabout way into the glycolytic pathway. But all of them ultimately enter in a similar pathway to eventually, be used by your body as ATP energy, right? So whether you're getting sugar from an apple or a carrot or Twizzlers, on a very strictly a molecular level, you're ultimately just still going to be entering the same pathway. Now, obviously, am I saying that having a bunch of sugar, having sugar from carrots is the same as getting sugar from Twizzlers? No, of course not, right? The sugar in Twizzlers is much more concentrated. It's way more easy. It's a lot easier to eat 100 grams of sugar from Twizzlers. Very easy to do that, as opposed to 100 grams of sugar from carrots. You'd have to eat a shit ton of carrots to get 100 grams of sugar, right? And you're probably not going to do that. And because of the fiber that's in the carrots, basically the rise in blood sugar that you would get from the sugar in carrots would be a lot more of a gradual rise, generally speaking, whereas the Twizzlers, because it's just pure carbohydrate, no fiber, no fat, you're going to have a more rapid increase and then rapid decline, like a spike and then decline in blood sugar. So, again, on a molecular level, sugar is not inherently bad. It's just there are some sources of it where it's a lot easier to eat really large quantities of it, and eating large quantities of sugar, is generally not ideal. Foods that are generally very dense in sugar are very easy to overeat and very easy to eat in a calorie surplus. And then that kind of eating in a calorie surplus and sort of constant highs and lows of blood sugars is not ideal. And that with gains in body fat that will occur when you're eating a lot, and sugar, what we think of as quote unquote sugary foods, lend themselves to eating in a calorie surplus, leads to fat gain, and then that can lead to those health problems. But sugar in itself is not inherently harmful. Our body just uses it to make glucose or fructose or galactose in those intersimilar pathways. It just comes down to the amount of it that we're having. Now, as far as addiction, food addiction, it's a pretty nuanced topic. It's something that even among researchers is pretty is very widely debated. And to be honest, it's not something that I've looked into enough to really say, yes, addiction is definitely a thing, or no, it's definitely not, or yes, sugar is definitely addictive or not. What I will tell you, and I made a post on this a while back. Basically, I was just reviewing a 2016 systematic review. And basically what they said is most of the direct evidence that's linking sugar and to addictive like behaviors has really been in animals. There's some, there's evidence that there's potentially some effects of sugar that mirror the effects of addictive drugs, in the brain. But these, it's still under a lot of debate, and whether that actually has an effect in humans is unclear. Food addiction, we do have something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which does operationalize food addiction, and criteria for that are, persistent eating despite negative consequences, constant desire for food, unsuccessful attempts to cut down on sugar, and then impaired functioning due to overeating. But there's still a lot of debate there, because some of the inclusion criteria for that do overlap with other things like binge eating disorder. So it's possible that when we're looking at food addiction using that criteria I just mentioned, we actually might be indirectly measuring another syndrome, like a binge eating disorder or something like that. So again, I don't really know for sure. I can see if I have that. Yeah, and then that systematic review was by Margaret et al. 2016, called Sugar Addiction: The State of Science. So that's pretty much what I have to say there. Short answer is I don't know. Maybe it has some addictive qualities. Is it addictive as like heroin? No. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, very good. So tying it back to the sugar point, I think you should only really worry or be concerned about your sugar intake if you're, pre-diabetic or you have type 2 diabetes. I think that's pretty much a good approach. And then it's a lot more nuanced than just sugar is bad, kind of like you said. So there's obviously carrots have sugar, and so does like Twizzlers. So you need to take your source of sugar in. And then the addiction, I really like the definition of addiction. It's like continued use despite adverse consequences. So it's like we like food is a basic need. So like to eat, there's completely nothing wrong with eating. But like if you're eating past the point of fullness, maybe it's an eating disorder. It's not necessarily an addiction. So it's kind of like a gray area by the sounds of it. Yeah. So then
I did have one point I actually wanted to just pop in there really quick. For individuals that have type 2 diabetes or are sort of on the borderline there, rather than focusing on sugar, I would recommend focusing on total carbohydrates, just carbohydrate intake in general. Obviously, if you are overweight or you have obesity and you have type 2 diabetes, losing body fat will likely improve insulin sensitivity. Then also just in general, monitoring your total carbohydrate intake, not just sugar, is really going to be where you'd want to place your focus to make sure that you are managing your blood sugar levels. So just wanted to hop in there real quick.
Yeah, very good. And then just another question I think of is for type 1 diabetics, would you have a different approach? Would you say they focus on sugar as opposed to total carbohydrate intake, or is it the same?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, type 1 diabetes, I'm a little bit less familiar with sort of specifics regarding how to approach nutrition for type 1 diabetes. I mean, obviously managing your blood sugar levels is really going to be critical to make sure you don't have any really high highs or low lows. I mean, again, it's not like it's going to be different with regards to sugar versus carbohydrate. It would still come down to total carbohydrate, but I'm really not an expert on type 1 diabetes, so I don't really want to kind of give any potential recommendations further, because be wrong. But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, prudent approach there. I like that. And then intermittent fasting is very popular recently. Do you have like any thoughts on that in terms of like who it could be useful for, and then people who should avoid it?
Yeah, it's funny. I've actually been implementing a time restricted eating, so a form of intermittent fasting as I'm sort of cutting at the moment. But yeah, so a couple of things. First off, if you actually go into the literature, technically intermittent fasting is often used to refer to something called alternate day fasting, where people maybe they eat very, very, very low calories 1 or 2 days per week and then eat normally the rest of the week. I think that what you're most likely referring to and what will be most likely more relevant to your listeners is time restricted eating, where each day you eat within a specific time window. Maybe it's 8 hours, 12 p.m. to 8 p.m., right? So first off, with the alternate day fasting, that is more so relevant for people who have obesity or have morbid obesity, who have a lot of weight to lose, because for them, and again, still you should do this while working with a practitioner, but for them, they have a lot of stored energy, so they have a lot of stored energy to utilize on those really low calorie days. It's not something I would recommend if you're not very, very overweight, the alternate day fasting. The time restricted eating can be very, very beneficial because it can really help control hunger levels. If you're eating just within an 8-hour window, it's a lot easier to eat in a calorie deficit. And you'll find that after you maybe an initial adjustment period, your hunger signals tend to mirror your habits, your sort of when you typically eat. So if you typically eat your first meal at 12 p.m., maybe after an adjustment period, you'll find that you won't really be hungry in the morning, generally speaking, and your hunger will generally rise when your body, quote unquote, expects food. So keeping your eating window to an 8 hour or whatever it is, if you are looking to lose body fat, it can be a nice way to make eating in a calorie deficit easier. Some people talk about something called autophagy and say, oh, that time restricted eating has all these other metabolic benefits because it's autophagy, your cells regenerating and all this stuff. And generally speaking, those benefits are more so from much longer fasts than just time restricted eating. It is possible that potentially limiting your food intake to the day and not eating at night might have some benefits with regard to insulin sensitivity and triglycerides and stuff. If any of your listeners are familiar with Danny Lennon's work, he's done a lot of work on that. But generally speaking, it is more so time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. Is a really nice way to make fat loss a little bit easier by making adhering to a calorie deficit a little bit easier.
Yeah. The way I like to think of time restricted feeding, I should have framed it that way, is that nutrition is very complicated. So if you have a set time window, it gets away from all the kind of like, what carbs should I have, what protein, all this kind of stuff. It just gives you a window, eat between then, don't overcomplicate it. And that's what you do, maybe 5 to 7 days out of the week, for example.
Yep, exactly. It can make things a lot more simple.
Yeah, especially for someone who's new to nutrition and tracking and that kind of stuff. Something else that's really popular that I think it's like the most consumed drug. So like caffeine and coffee is like the most consumed drug in the world, I think. But, that kind of is a bit of a loaded way of explaining it. What effect do you think it has on sleep and appetite? For someone trying to improve their health, what effects will it have on those?
Yeah, good question. So first off, I think it's important to differentiate the terms caffeine and coffee, just because a lot of people use those terms synonymously, right? Caffeine is one compound that is in coffee, and it's the main compound that makes you feel alert and awake, not tired, sometimes all jazzed, energized, sometimes jittery, anxious. All that stuff is caffeine. It's found in caffeine in coffee, but obviously it's also found in pre-workouts, smaller amounts in teas, smaller amounts in chocolate, stuff like that, supplements. So I'm just going to talk specifically about caffeine. Now, you asked about sleep, and what was the other thing you asked about?
An appetite, effect on appetite.
Yeah, so caffeine will definitely, especially depending on when you have it, when you consume it, will negatively affect sleep because it literally it mechanistically basically prevents tiredness. When when uh, when basically adenosine binds in the brain, it makes you feel sleepy. Caffeine prevents adenosine from binding in the brain. It blocks that receptor. So having caffeine somewhat close to your bedtime is not a good idea. Um, and exactly when you should have it, generally the earlier the better. People really vary in how caffeine affects them. One, if you've been having caffeine for a while, you've become tolerant to some of its effects, so it might not have the same energetic effect that it once did. And then genetically and just people also differ in how they metabolize caffeine and sort of genetic variants there that can affect the extent to which caffeine will impair your sleep. But something to know is that caffeine generally has a half-life of 6 hours. Now, what does that mean? So if you have a cup of coffee, say the cup of coffee has 150 milligrams of caffeine in it, and say you have that cup of coffee at noon, 6 hours later at 6 p.m., you'll have half of that 150 milligrams still circling around. So you'll have 75 milligrams of caffeine still in your system, right? So that's important to keep in mind considering when we have our caffeine relative to when we go to bed. So you want to time it earlier. If you are not tolerant to caffeine or you don't typically have large amounts, you'd want to be careful with having a large dose like right away, because you're more likely to experience some of the negative effects of not being able to sleep well, or anxiety, jitteriness, gastrointestinal effects if you're not particularly tolerant to it. And be mindful of the dose. So the FDA has generally said that doses of up to 400 milligrams per day are not harmful. I'll tell you, I pretty routinely drink more than that every day, and I know a decent amount of people that do. And for a lot of folks, a dose of caffeine that is going to enhance your performance oftentimes is more than that. It's generally 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. If you weigh 200 pounds, that could be more than 400 milligrams. So it's kind of a balance there, but it definitely can affect sleep. And then you also asked about appetite. Caffeine does have the potential to reduce appetite acutely, although that effect, I believe, does fade with time. As you become more tolerant to caffeine, that effect does fade. And actually, other stimulants also have a similar effect as well. Like people who take ADHD medication often experience that it's it's very stimulatory, but it reduces their hunger. I guess if someone is in like bodybuilding prep or something, then using caffeine for that purpose might be useful. But generally speaking, I wouldn't use caffeine specifically for that purpose of reducing appetite, just because you're going to run into tolerance anyway. So you're going to kind of hit a point where it stops working, and now you're addicted to 500 milligrams of caffeine, whatever it is. Yeah. So but it's a great supplement. I use it every day.
Yeah, you can get into the trap of like a race to the bottom where you're taking in more caffeine or more coffee. We'll just say coffee, and your sleep is being impeded more and more. So you have more caffeine, more coffee, and then it's just a vicious cycle. So yeah, you definitely want to be aware of your sleep and the effect that the coffee you're consuming is having on that. So a question I often wonder in terms of nutrition is, which is more important, the quality of the food you eat or the quantity of the food you eat in terms of energy and calories for long-term health? So like if you were to advise someone who's like 20 years old or someone young, a young listener, and you were to say, this is what you want to focus on for, maximizing the quality and the duration of your life. And if I was to just try and answer that myself, I feel like it might be the wrong question to ask, but you're the man in the know. So what are your thoughts on quality of the food you eat versus quantity of calories of the food you consume?
Well, I think, I'm going to kind of also give, again, a cop-out answer that it depends, because both of those are intertwined. Now, as far as quantity, if you were talking strictly about fat loss and someone's only goal was fat loss or weight loss, then it would really come down to the quantity of food, the quantity of calories they are eating, and then macronutrients, protein, stuff like that. But that would be the driving factor behind weight loss and fat loss. However, you'd want to focus on the types of foods that you're eating to facilitate that, right? Because going to our conversation earlier, if you wanted to do fat loss and be in a calorie deficit and just focus on a quantitative component, but you're eating nothing but Twizzlers and donuts every day, it's going to be pretty damn hard to eat in a calorie deficit eating just Twizzlers and donuts because, it's very hard. Those are such tasty foods and so calorie dense that you're going to have a hard time. Whereas if you're eating a lot of lean protein, chicken, a lot of veggies, very high volume, low calorie foods like potatoes, and moderate amounts of generally heart healthy fats, you're going to have an easier time sticking to that calorie deficit. As far as just general health, I mean, they're both intertwined, but obviously, the quality of the food, the types of foods that you're eating are really going to be what drives everything, right? We know there's a ridiculous amount of research showing that a Mediterranean diet, which is basically what we should all think of when we think of a healthy diet, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, unsaturated fats like monounsaturated fats like from olive oils and nuts and avocado and other polyunsaturated fats like from seeds and stuff like that, low amounts of saturated fat, low to no trans fat, fish, fatty fish, getting omega-3, stuff like that. Those people tend to have the best health outcomes. They tend to live the longest. And then with that, if you're eating that type of diet, you're probably not going to end up you might, but you're unlikely to end up eating in a calorie surplus where you would be gaining a bunch of weight, which would increase the risk for health issues. So, and for a general population, counting calories might not be necessary. Counting macros might not be necessary. Just focusing on healthful habits, healthful eating habits, like what I just described, or modifying it if someone's a vegetarian or they have food allergies or whatever, would probably be the best approach.
Yeah. So quality, makes a lot more sense. I think there'd be a lot more benefits to focusing on the quality of your food, whereas you'd miss out on those benefits just focusing on the quantity. Again, it kind of be a race to the bottom. How little can I consume, or how tightly can I regulate my calories when you're completely missing all the benefits that come with eating a diet like the Mediterranean diet. Yep. Could you speak a little bit about like the social support? So I feel like they're very community orientated in the Mediterranean, and that also has an effect on health and your eating. Do you have any thoughts around that, and maybe how you kind of, work with clients and discuss maybe social support?
Yeah, well, just generally speaking, we know that for not just weight loss, but for weight loss maintenance and just health in general, having the support of those around you is extremely important. It's really hard to changing your habits, changing your eating habits and lifestyle habits to be more healthful is already pretty difficult. And if the people around you aren't necessarily supportive or don't share the same goals as you, that can make things even monumentally more difficult. So, we know that people who have that accountability from a dietitian or a coach, or, have a support group, that's one thing about Weight Watchers where, certainly not perfect, but they get the social support thing down really well, as having a group of people who you can kind of rely on when things get tough, as inevitably do. Having other people who are going through a similar experience as you, who you can talk to and relate to, is hugely important. Or ideally having a doctor or practitioner who also is looking out for you, and who you have that relationship with, is very, very important.
Yeah, it's kind of like overlooked, but just having support as you go along that journey, that's going to be a challenge. With an expert or even just socially from a friend or partner is invaluable. We'll kind of come close to wrapping up here, but like just one of the really kind of relevant questions is like protein intake. So you had a post about focusing on your total protein intake over the day as opposed to protein timing. So So could you talk about, the timing of protein versus your total daily intake, and then just also kind of like peri-workout nutrition and like, what you'd recommend for someone who, let's just say they're trying to build muscle, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so a lot of us lifters tend to micromanage, or maybe not as much these days, but at least there was a time where a lot of us would micromanage our protein timing. We'd be like, oh my God, I have to get my protein shake within half an hour, or my workout is wasted, or within an hour, or whatever it is. And now we know that's just not the case, and I mean, there's a kernel of truth to that, in that, after your workout, generally muscle protein synthesis is elevated to a greater extent. And in general, having a meal with protein in it at some point after your workout is probably makes sense. And because muscle protein synthesis does sort of have a threshold where after you get above that threshold, which is from eating protein or leucine specifically, it doesn't increase further. And it probably makes sense to ideally, eat a pretty decent dose of protein, maybe 3 different times per day at least is probably ideal, but it's not nearly as important as the total amount of protein that you're eating every day. And then obviously, in assuming that you're following a well-structured resistance training program, I mean, the total amount of protein you're eating over the course of the day is by far more important than the timing of it. That's just a fact. So like I said, beyond that, if you are getting, if you're relatively lean, like, at least like 0.7 grams per protein per pound, or 1.6 grams per kg, then you're probably in good shape there. At some point after your workout, within maybe a couple hours, it probably makes sense to have something with protein in it. Some people also find that, having something with pretty easily digestible carbs, so a source of carbs that's like low in fiber, rice cakes, white bread, Twizzlers, I don't know, whatever, within a couple hours before your workout might be a good idea. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing still is your intake over the course of 24 hours of protein and carbohydrates and stuff like that. So, it's not to say that meal timing is useless, but it's certainly not the most important thing.
Yeah, in order of priority, it's lower down than what happens over the full day.
Exactly.
And yeah, and it's kind of actually like a lot more work that, oftentimes is ineffective when we do micromanage like that.
Yep.
Yeah. And then it just makes me think of how, useful it is to work with a coach, where you can use a lot of trial and error in terms of trying, white bread, brown bread, Twizzlers, whatever you want, around your workouts, and see how that, impacts your workouts and your progress, to really get some like expert feedback on the approach you have.
Yeah, and also it's so difficult for any of us to be objective with our own nutrition or our own training, even if we are experts. So it is really helpful to have an objective feedback on how to on what changes to implement, what changes are optimal versus what we can let go. Because obviously we can't do everything perfectly optimally. It's just a matter of finding what we should do that fits us best, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. Like even athletes, for example, sometimes LeBron James likes to relax with a glass of wine, and a glass of wine isn't going to make him perform better, but maybe that's his way of relaxing when done in moderation. So speaking of alcohol, and then you have a post as well about cannabis. The question would be, can you still use cannabis or alcohol and still be fit? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get too in depth because we are coming short on time, but yeah, you absolutely can be fit and use either one. Most adults probably do use, not all, but most of them probably use at least one or the other. It just comes back to, like we were talking about before, about moderation. You know what I mean? I mean, alcohol, I don't have to tell you, as if you have too much of it, it can literally kill you and have terrible effects. But as long as you drink in moderation, and if you are looking for fat loss, then ensure that you are accounting for the calories that are in alcohol, right? Because alcohol is technically a 4th macronutrient. So if you're tracking macros, you probably want to allocate the calories from the alcohol to either carbs or fats. So just make sure you're accounting for it, and be wary of the fact that, of course, as we all know, when you do drink alcohol, your inhibitions are lowered, so it's easier to overeat. So we just want to be responsible there. And cannabis is great in that it does not have any calories in it. Obviously, it sort of depends on the individual and depends on the strain, but using cannabis will increase hunger, as most of us know. You get the munchies, and there's, it'll increase ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. So, we do want to be mindful of that and use that responsibly if we are going to do so. But there's beyond that, there's really no reason why, you don't. Some people might find that giving up one or both of those helps them to achieve their goals, but you certainly don't have to.
Yeah, they do have utility, and if you're responsible with how you use them, and use moderation, you can definitely still make progress. But I think it's kind of, in my personal opinion, it's kind of like an extra factor to deal with that can kind of like muddy the waters of, trying to get a clear image of like what challenges someone has with their health, or, what helps them make progress. So it's very, very individual specific, but it's good to know that you can still be fit and use those. Dan, thanks very much for your time. Do you have anything you want to mention? I would be a big advocate of Examine. It's an amazing, amazing site and resource. So anyone who's listening, check that out. Do you have anything coming up or anything you want to mention before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered things pretty well. I mean, like I mentioned at the outset, I am taking new clients in my private practice. I do take many forms of health insurance, such as like Blue Cross Blue Shield and Aetna and Cigna and stuff like that. So, if you're listening and want to learn more, you can send me an email at dan@danfeldmanrd.com. You can check out my Instagram at Powerlifter Dietitian. Get in touch with me. Because if you're in the United States, you probably pay a lot for health insurance anyway. Might as well get the most out of it. But other than that, I think we covered things pretty well. It's been a pleasure to be on.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. It was a very interesting and insightful conversation. And thanks for your time.
Yeah, likewise.